So in the first reading, we have this beautiful, rosy picture of, the early community that's painted before us, of them with such deep love for each other. There was no division among them. They shared everything in common. Contrast that with the context of the gospel reading. And so, I want you to, for a moment, place yourselves in the place of those disciples, right? So, they were following Jesus. They hoped that he was the Messiah. And then, things were going well for some time. He was performing all these miracles. There was a big crowd following him. And then things started going downhill. One of them betrayed him. And then he was arrested. One of them denied him. Peter denied him 3 times. And then they see what they did to him. They crucified him. And so they witnessed, the crucifixion. They saw that he was buried. And to make matters worse, now, after 3 days, you had these women who went to the tomb and see that the body was not there. 2 of them went and also witnessed to the same fact that the body was not there. And then there were people talking about the disciples stealing the body. So can you imagine now their fear in that locked room, trying to imagine what would happen to them if they were arrested, for stealing Jesus' body. So they were filled with fear, and rightly so. And it is in their fear that Jesus appears to them. And of course, now, they're probably getting even more frightened, oh my God, how do you now, in terms of a relationship, your master, who you had in many ways run away from. Many of those disciples, when the trial, the arrest and all took place, they kind of distanced themselves from Jesus. Can you imagine now them seeing Jesus? The shame that they probably felt. And how do you deal with your master who's now come back, and how do you explain to him why you deserted him? So there was all this turmoil that was going on within them. And so Jesus very rightly says, peace be with you. Don't worry about all this. Peace be with you. And he shows them his hands and his feet. Again, this is the Gospel of John. And so John is also, in his Gospel, trying to, powerfully convey the message that this risen Christ whom they are seeing is the same Christ, the same Jesus, who suffered, died, and was buried. The same Jesus with those wounds is now the risen Christ. So the risen Christ is not now somebody out there, distant, away from us. It is the same Jesus who suffered, died, and was buried, and then rose again. And again, what John is inviting us to in that emphasis is that this risen Christ comes to us in his woundedness. And so Pope Francis also has, on a couple of occasions and a couple of homilies, drawn our attention to the fact that Jesus comes to us as the wounded Jesus, understanding us as well in our sufferings. And I'm sure during this last year with the pandemic, many of us have gone through a lot of suffering ourselves. We probably lost a dear one. We knew somebody who passed away. There was, we couldn't meet people. We couldn't go shopping. There was a lot of pain. But to understand that Jesus was there with us is important. And Jesus continues, as we celebrate in this Easter season, that we celebrate the risen Christ. Again, we're celebrating a Jesus who knows what it is to be human and who is there with us in our pain, in our suffering, in our woundedness. The second aspect is, of course, of Thomas, right, who was not there. And Thomas, wanting, some tangible proof. And it's possible that the other disciples were still grappling with what they had witnessed. And so when Thomas comes back, he sees them, and they probably still look like, confused and were still living the same way. And it's not possible that you all could have seen, Jesus again, that Jesus appeared to you all, because you all are still, living the same way as before. And so he says, no, unless I put my finger in his wounds and his side, I'm not going to believe it. And then, of course, Jesus appears to them again and invites Thomas to place his finger in his hands and in his side. Now, of course, the gospel doesn't say whether Thomas actually did. I don't think he did, because but he wanted some tangible proof that the same Jesus, who was crucified, that the same Jesus had risen, right? We too, in our own life journey and our spiritual journey, sometimes we want spiritual proof. We want something that's tangible, some evidence that God exists. And again, a lot of that, and for many people during this pandemic, they suffered a lot of anxiety and disbelief or unbelief in terms of, is there a God? Why doesn't God do something, right? When we're seeing loved ones that are passing away, or who are kind of or different situations. But here's where, and the gospel goes on to say, blessed are those who will not see and still believe. Here's where and that is where faith kind of calls us to move beyond sometimes tangible proofs of God's existence, to surrendering ourselves to the fact that God loves us. And that is, what Thomas ultimately, that he says, my Lord and my God. And again, Pope Francis, one of his earlier homilies, he emphasizes on that my. And it's very different from, you saying, this is my car or my house. Can you say my God, as if you own God? And that's not the point. I think Thomas's acclamation of my Lord and my God is a testimony to the fact that he recognized the relationship that God had with him, that Jesus had with him. And so he acknowledges that deep intimacy when he says, my Lord and my God, that he surrenders himself in that relationship as well. Again, an invitation to us to surrender ourselves to God's love for us. So let me end with a story. There was this pastor, much like our pastor, Father Damien, who was out on a vacation, probably before COVID times, and was in an airplane. And as they were moving along, they were approaching apparently a storm, and so the pilot announced that they're not going to have the meal service because, there was a storm that was approaching. And of course, there was a lot of, people getting a little fidgety and anxious. And lo and behold, they get into the storm, and the airplane starts tossing up and down. And if you have been in an airplane, in a storm, know exactly what it is like. Plane started kind of going, it started suddenly losing altitude, and it was really panicky. And he kind of looked around. He was scared himself. So he looked around, and he saw that people were really, really anxious, and there was this, people are praying desperately. But then he also notices this little girl who had, her feet tucked under her, this thing, and she was reading a book. And she didn't seem to be bothered about the storm at all. She was happily reading the book, didn't seem to be disturbed. And so he was just amazed by that response of this little girl. So anyway, they land safely, and after all the passengers hurriedly disembark, the pastor decides to wait for a little while. And then he goes up to that little girl who's still in her seat, and he says, darling, he says, I noticed when we were in that storm, you didn't seem to be bothered at all. And the little girl looks up at him and says, oh, that's because my dad is the pilot. and he's taking me home. The dad is my pilot. The pilot is my dad, and he's taking me home. She had total trust in her father, who was the pilot, and she knew that her father would take her safely home. So we are invited, as we kind of celebrate this Easter season, we are invited to have that same kind of trust in God, that even when things don't go well, when we are struggling, that God, who is our Father, cares for us and will take us through the various storms that life confronts us with.